All right, so our second presenter is here, Dr. Monica Felix. She's going to present on spiritual hospitality. She's a licensed clinical psychologist in California, and she received her doctorate degree in clinical psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary, where she also earned a master's degree in theology. She has spent her career working for the California Department of State Hospitals, and as a forensic clinical psychologist, she has worked with severely and persistently mentally ill patients and provided evidence-based treatment such as dialectical behavior therapy. And she also served Sunday school teacher at the Antiochian Women's Group Parish, parish president, and participated in the Assembly of Bishops Needs Assessment Workbook and the Peace of Mind, which we heard earlier, facilitator for the Assembly of Bishops. She lives in Napa with her husband and 2 boys and currently attends St. Seraphim OCA Parish in Santa Rosa, California. And with no further ado, I'm going to welcome Dr. Monica. Thank you.
Thank you. Hospitality is often understood in the context of physical offerings, such as food and drink. While such tangible needs are necessary and important part of our being, these alone are not a sufficient understanding of Christian hospitality. Spiritual needs must be considered in our offering of hospitality. Spiritual hospitality is a virtue. It is honoring God's image in each of us. It is loving others and nurturing relationships, and in practicing such spiritual hospitality, healing and growth in Christ can take place. Consider the story of the woman caught in adultery. The scribes and the Pharisees bring the woman to Christ, exclaim her sin, and reference Moses' law for stoning. They seem to anticipate Christ will support them in their self-righteousness. But instead we read, Christ stooped down and presumably next to the adulterous woman. In doing this, Christ put himself in quite a precarious situation. This woman was caught in the very act of sin. Her transgression was made public. Christ, of course, knows all of this and was not deterred in joining her. He did not hesitate to stoop down. What is palpable here is Christ's presence. He made his presence known to the woman at her hour of judgment. In a moment of desperate need, filled with despair, shame, fear, and isolation, in the face of public condemnation, he communicated that she is valuable, and his presence served as protection for her. Christ simultaneously made his presence known to the woman's accusers. He let them know, first by action and then by words, that he is her ally. His positioning forced the accusers to pause their condemnation so as not to assault an innocent man. I imagine these men were stunned and confused, perhaps even angry, that they'd been stalled from enforcing the law. The Jewish leaders likely anticipated to be validated by the man they called, quote, teacher. However, Christ's action is articulated when he tells them that he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. The men proceeded to leave one by one, realizing their own sinfulness. And with gentleness, Christ reassures the woman that neither he will judge her. As readers of this story, we may take for granted that Christ does not judge this woman. Perhaps because we've heard this story several times over, or we dismiss it as part of Christ's all-loving nature, thinking, of course Christ would act mercifully. Or perhaps we feel inadequate in our ability to love as Christ does, with full acceptance of the other person and without judgment. But consider this scenario with the woman a bit more closely. The woman was caught in the act of adultery. It wasn't hearsay or a rumor. It wasn't suspicion or false accusation. She was caught. And the law was clear that adultery was to be punished. None of these facts swayed Christ against the woman. He did not let such rational arguments direct his engagement. Rather, he chose to lead with compassion. He opened his heart to this woman and offered her love. She, I imagine, felt seen for her personhood. And this was likely a shift for her, who was likely accustomed to being objectified. I suspect if she was once aware of her dignity in God, that in that moment it was no longer in her consciousness. She had forgotten her value, and doesn't this happen to all of us? We get so caught up in our sin and shame that we dismiss our value. But Christ offered the woman this truth, the truth that we have inherent value as a creation in God's image. And though we are lost sheep, we have been saved, adopted, and offered a heavenly inheritance. Christ offered her a gift of realizing her identity as seen by Christ, as seen by God. He showed her she has value and is a person of worth. I can only imagine how uplifting this must have been. And I suspect that the woman's ability to hear Jesus' words, sin no more, was predicated on Jesus' offering of love first. It's through his love that she experienced her humanity honored and acknowledged, and she was likely able to go and repent, or so I assume she did. Note how Christ's actions are in direct contrast to the accusers. They led with reason, a type of reasoning that lacked compassion, whereas Christ led with his heart, in that compassion took priority when engaging the woman. This is what we are called to do when we are commanded to love one another, that we lead with our heart. When we, like the accusers, are guided with reason alone, we will fail likely to truly listen, show empathy, and offer compassion, and instead make assertions about the person's behavior, such as right or wrong, identifying mistakes, and even giving sage advice. This approaches the other from a place of expertise and implies a relationship of superiority. The suggestion here is not to eliminate critical thinking, but rather when engaging others, we should choose to initiate with a soft, compassionate heart. And doesn't this make sense given the commands to love, to forgive, and to not judge? These commands are all relationship focused, such that we are putting the other person first and opening the door for healing and reconciliation. Father Alexis Vinogradov tells us we become real neighbors when, quote, one soul acknowledges another, one person's long and complex history meets and joins an equally precious and complex history of another individual, end quote. Being a true neighbor is being able to see one another fully and wholly. It is accepting each other in our current state of being, honoring each other as a child of God created in his image. It is in this context of being seen and embraced for who I am with a messy history and current struggles that I experience love and healing occurs. As Father Luke Rabbi Toomey simply puts it, hospitality plays an important role in healing humankind. In order to understand this meeting of souls and what gets in our way, we must turn our attention to love. When we consider loving others, we typically focus our attention outside of ourselves. We often think of making some sort of offering to express our love. However, such gestures, while good, are intended to be an expression of love. Mindless action does not prepare a heart to fully love. A humble heart is needed in order to lead with love and to be able to fully love. Humility, though, is often misunderstood as self-deprecation. This looks like putting myself down, thinking I am invisible, hiding myself, and even punishing myself. The problem with this ideology is that believing that I am not valuable and I have nothing to offer. This thinking also runs the risk of behaving badly, because if I don't matter, no one's paying attention to me, so I don't have to be mindful of how I act, and I may be reckless in my interactions. Perhaps my ability to fully love another is actually predicated on our ability to love ourselves. And in that, we must give grace to ourselves. If I don't love myself as the person God created me to be, it will be a struggle to love anyone else who was also created by God and in his image. This requires looking within ourselves. An unexamined heart makes it difficult to embrace others in our own hearts, and it can also result in self-deprecation. Not only is self-deprecation a distorted understanding of humility, it is not aligned with our Orthodox Christian faith, as it does not honor our createdness in the image of God, or our goal of theosis. Humility, rather, Father Stephen Freeman explains, quote, allows us to see the truth of ourselves as well as the truth of God, end quote. Humility is anchoring myself in truth and emptying myself to Christ. It is not that I am nothing, but rather that I am nothing without Christ. It is that the recognition that I am weak, but my weakness can be made strong through Christ, that I may be used as a vessel for his glory and the salvation of others. Father Luke Rabi Toomey asserts that due to our fallen state, we are not only estranged from God, but from each other and even ourselves. We learn from Father Stephen Freeman that the pursuit of knowledge of God inherently includes the knowledge of ourselves, both as we are present, as we have been wounded, as we are healed, and finally, as we are in wholeness. Thus, the first step to hospitably loving others after seeking God is pursuing self-knowledge, so that we may open our heart to the other. A heart that fails to recognize pain, sin, and struggle, the struggles that consume it, will be unable to tolerate the hurts and pains of others because it already is emotionally depleted with its own suffering. When my response is overly rational and judgmental or rooted in fear, the effect is to create interpersonal distance, which in turn has the effect of eliminating my participation in sharing their burdens. Responses such as judgment offer a less emotionally taxing approach for the listener. For instance, I believe adultery is bad and I am good. Thus, I cannot be associated with adultery. I will not condone adultery, and thus I will both condemn this woman caught in the act of adultery and avoid making intimate contact with her. Additionally, there may be the added layer of concern of what others may think. One might wonder, what will people think if I associate with this adulterous woman? What if they think I'm friends with her? What, or worse, that I myself am also adulterous? These responses are rooted in fear and perhaps even disgust. We desire to protect ourselves from the ugliness of sin, and because we are afraid of coming in close contact with it, we create distance. That's what judgment does. It creates an emotional distance from the person and their struggles. We don't like to think of it this way, but the effect is real. And even referring to the woman as an adulteress identifies her by her sin and makes it easier to dismiss her humanity, and her createdness in the image of God. Our words are powerful tools. Until I know myself, my fears, my shame, and my obstacles, I will not have room in my heart for anything or anyone else. My shame lives in my heart. It will be hard to make space for anyone else. When my shame lives in my heart, it will be hard to make space for anyone else. If I believe that I'm so bad that I'm unworthy of love, belonging, and connection, which is the definition of shame, then I believe that no one wants to be around me and I have nothing meaningful to offer. So I isolate, which creates fertile ground for shame to grow exponentially into every corner and crevice of our lives. And doesn't this sound like sin? It permeates into all aspects of our lives and only gets worse with secrecy. Thus, not only am I blocking my heart from knowing others, I'm blocking others from knowing me. The more I judge myself, the more I assume others are judging me, and the more I project judgment onto others. And because shame is a social emotion, I'm afraid of other people's reactions if they were to see my true self. I fear vulnerability, which is exposing my thoughts, feelings, experiences, failures, ignorance, and subsequently I fear being mocked, appearing dumb, and feeling inadequate. It takes effort and intentionality to know oneself, to examine my thoughts, feelings, and reactions, to uncover what is driving my fears, identify how my past hurts may be resurfacing, and recognize what is taking up space in my heart. It is a process of uncovering our struggles, our triggers, discerning truth versus lies. Self-examination can occur through repentance and confession, and dare I say, psychotherapy. The more I attend to my heart, the more I will realize how this sin has infiltrated my life and has taken many forms. And though not all brokenness is the result of my personal sin, but can rather be a consequence of other sin or the general state of fallenness, I remain responsible for addressing the brokenness that affects me and work towards healing. Knowing myself is an ongoing process full of layers and uncovering blind spots. And though a grinding process, it is necessary for salvation, both my own and others. Becoming acquainted with my brokenness allows me to understand myself, recognize how I affect others, and offer empathy. When I'm able to recognize what is happening internally for myself, I can better attend to what may be happening for the other person. Being able to attend to another person entails being fully present for them. Listening without distraction, honoring their experiences without imposing myself, demands that I have recognition and ability to stop myself from giving into those strong urges to judge and intellectualize, which disregards the person's lived experiences. It demands that I enter into the person's pain and sit with it without trying to fix or change anything, to identify urges which are unhelpful, even harmful, to fight them, to practice sitting still in pain. So I only have 5 minutes left, so I want to sort of move forward a little bit. Not only do fear-based responses create interpersonal distance, but they may lead to self-judgment and self-hatred. Like the woman in the story, we all have our sinful pasts. Though our paths each look different, mistakes have surely been made. Some mistakes more upsetting and more harmful than others. Suppressing the shame will only cause it to fester and to grow. As mentioned earlier, the side effects of shame is isolation and hiding oneself. When I am filled with shame and engage in self-deprecation, I fail to nurture the talents God has given me. Rather, like the wicked and lazy servant, I bury my talents out of fear. Santikon tells us that it is our obligation to share our spiritual treasures with others, and states that this directive is for all members of the church, pastors, missionaries, and lay people. We are called to be good stewards of our talents. Ask God to redeem your heart, your hurt, and use it for healing for others. Each of us possesses gifts or talents from God. Up until recently, I interpret this as tangible things such as having a singing voice or being an artist. But what I've actually come to realize is this. When we seek God and allow Him to act in our lives, He can and will transform us in our experiences, even or especially the hurtful ones. That thing that we were once ashamed of can be redeemed, and it can be used as a talent or benefit for the benefit of others. I say this from personal experience, as a divorcee who for years hid out of shame. However, I've realized that despite my experience feeling awful, if I allow myself to be seen and known, I can actually use this experience to help others. And though still a painful topic for me, I'm slowly talking more about it, which I believe has resulted in mutual healings. Having self-awareness does not mean we must share our intimacies with everyone as a gesture of hospitality. But in being self-aware, we allow for the opportunity for spiritual hospitality. Intimate sharing happens over time once a safe space has been established. Spiritual hospitality is the opening of our hearts and minds to the other person's whole self in their current state as they are in that moment with no judgments. It's allowing my brokenness to come alongside of and in contact with your brokenness. It is through such honest love and vulnerability we enter communion and experience healing. We must be willing to touch the other, literally and figuratively, in order to embrace the other in Christ. It is creating room for the other in this space that both parties can heal. It is in this space that we do spiritual work that helps us move towards theosis. And to summarize St. Anthony the Great, our neighbor is our salvation. We are called not only to see Christ in one another, but to also be Christ to one another. In this, we are to reflect to others the truth that they are created in His image. They possess His goodness, regardless of what the circumstances may be. This requires that we believe and embrace this truth for ourselves. think I will stop there. All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monica. Yeah, what a beautiful presentation. And I can start with a comment, and while you're thinking, do you have a couple of nuggets? How do we use this practical suggestions for healers? Right? I mean, there's many threads, and I don't want to summarize that, but in your words, like if there's a home take message, what we as healers, knowing ourselves, right? It seems like working with our shame, but if you have some other...
Yeah, I mean, I think there is two contexts in OCAMPR. There's a church context, and then there's like the clinical context. And I think in the clinical context, most of us have probably, at least I would say the therapists, and that's my background, we've been told in our training that we must know ourselves, right? And if it's not mandated, it's highly encouraged to do our own therapy.
Yes.
And that's why, right? Because as a psychologist in training, it was like, we don't want your stuff getting confused with the client's stuff.
Yes.
And really bringing a lot of that into the church, because that's not a therapy thing, that's a human thing.
Yes.
Right? It's, I have stuff because my lived experience is different from your lived experience, and you have stuff, and knowing what's what, yes. And knowing when my stuff is getting in the way of me being present for you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So helpful.
Thanks for that question.
Thanks very much. Perhaps if you would mind just expanding it a little bit, you had mentioned the idea of sitting with pain.
Yeah.
Briefly. And in our societal context, that's a very, very uncomfortable thing. Yeah. Lots of our focus in terms of the medical profession and in psychology is trying to alleviate physical and emotional pain. But you had made the argument that there's value to that. Could you just speak a little bit more about that, perhaps from how you've maybe been able to see how that can be useful in a clinical context?
Sure. I mean, I would say that clinically, it is helpful to sit with the pain, right? If I have someone who's coming to me with pain, because I'm a psychologist, I'm assuming that it's emotional pain. It is not useful or helpful to tell them how to fix it without getting to know them first. Like entering into that pain of like, what is ailing you? What is bothering you? How does it feel like for you? Not how I think it feels for them. Tell me your experience, right? And being able to really feel that pain. So like for trauma treatment, when doing exposure, the goal of exposure is to sit with the emotion, right?
Exposure prevention, right? Expose and prevent, just exposure.
So imaginal. So imaginal exposure. So if I'm imagining, reimagining the trauma situation, I'm sitting with the emotion, right? So this is not in vivo. In vivo would probably, you would want that prevention piece, but it's not when in my context, having worked in the state hospital system, in vivo is usually not possible. And so when you're doing imaginal exposure, you're just thinking about it, and then the emotion comes up. Right? Whether it's fear or shame or anxiety, whatever the emotion is, it's usually shame. You're sitting with it. And you're not doing anything to make it feel better. You're not using any breathing skills. No one's patting you on the back, because that distracts. What really makes it dysfunctional is when we don't know how to tolerate our emotions and our pain. If I'm suppressing pain, I'm suppressing joy. I don't get to pick and choose my emotions. And so learning how to sit with, how to tolerate, how to experience that emotion and integrate it in a healthy way in my life. And that is the goal. We're not running away, we're not soothing, we're not fixing, we're learning to live with. Does that help or answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. And that is a great point. And the good news, we have the process of habituation, which is not just on a body level, but an emotional level. So there is a God-given gift for the reactions to go down that is helping in the process. Would you say that that's...
Right. So with the so if you're doing the exposure piece, is that you get them to feel that, you get them to sit with it without any sort of distractions. And after a certain period of time, there are established periods of time, but it really depends on the extent of the trauma. The emotion goes down because what you're learning is that it's not dangerous, right? Mm-hmm. Because all of those other things, right? Even though they're good coping skills, we all do it. Hey, I need a hug. I did it today. I'm I need a hug. Those are healthy coping skills, right? But when you're doing it, and there's also unhealthy coping skills. When you're doing any of those to avoid an emotion and you're not dealing with it, it's going to pop up in other parts of your life. And you're avoiding it because you're afraid of something. And so if you sit with it and you tolerate it, you learn there's nothing to be afraid of. There was in your history, but that's no longer here, right now. It's safe.
Thank you. Is there a quick comment or question? Quick? Yes, quick.
Make a very quick comment just to support what you're saying from a theological standpoint. A key heresy in the history of the church is Nestorianism. Yes. And the separation of the divinity and the humanity of Christ. So the key problem with it was, how can Jesus be divine and suffer? And the connection here is that we don't have to come down from the cross, right? So we want to avoid suffering, but the way that we avoid suffering is not by coming down from the cross, but as Christ suffered on the cross, but suffered impassively. So this is St. Cyril's response to Nestorius, right? Saying that, no, it's not that he didn't suffer. He suffered in the flesh, but as Christ suffered, we can also suffer, where it doesn't change his nature and it doesn't change his being and it doesn't negatively affect him the way that it naturally affects us. So the key is not to suffer just for the sake of suffering, but to have meaning in that suffering, and chasing that impassable suffering is the destination.
Yeah. And this is
yes.
One short sentence, and then we'll...
Yeah, I just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think, one of the pieces, I did have to, honestly skip a little bit, but one of the pieces was just kind of our suffering can be a talent that used in service of other people in hospitality, right? And so if I'm hiding because I'm afraid of judgment, or I'm ashamed of my suffering, whatever it may be, I'm not using that to serve anyone, right? And it is a talent, right? If it's something that God has blessed, redeemed, and I can use it to heal, to help other people in their suffering and their healing, that's a talent. And we're hiding ourselves, and that is not in service of hospitality or theosis, which is our goal.
Thank you so much, Dr.